Hi everyone, I'm Arthur. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to look at a line graph showing changes in home ownership rates among different age groups in the UK between 1996 and 2015. This is a classic, realistic IELTS-style question that tests your ability to describe trends, make comparisons, and summarize key information. We'll go step by step through how to analyze the graph, how to write the introduction, how to write the overview, how to structure your details, common mistakes to avoid, and finally, I'll give you a full Band 9 model answer you can learn from. So make sure you watch until the end because everything builds toward that model answer. Let's begin by looking at the chart on your screen. This graph shows the percentage of people who owned homes across four age groups: 25 to 29, 30 to 34, 35 to 39, and 40 to 44, between 1996 and 2015. This kind of multi-line graph is extremely common in IELTS Writing Task 1 because it tests your ability to handle multiple categories and a long time series. This is the prompt. The line graph compares homeownership rates among four age groups in the UK between 1996 and 2015. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Before you start writing, you need to understand the main story that this graph is telling. In this chart, there are four key patterns that you should notice and later mention in your overview and body paragraphs. First, the most obvious pattern is that all four lines move downward over time. When you look at the graph, you can see that each age group begins at a higher point in 1996 and ends at a much lower point in 2015. None of the groups show an increase. This tells us that, overall, home ownership became less common for people aged 25 to 44 over this period. The second pattern is that the older age groups consistently have higher home ownership rates than the younger ones. From the beginning to the end of the period, the lines for people in their late 30s and early 40s stay above the other two groups. Even though their rates fall, the 35 to 39 and 40 to 44 age groups remain the most likely to own a home in every year shown on the graph. The third pattern is that the youngest age group experiences the sharpest fall. If you focus on the line for 25 to 29-year-olds, you can see that it drops much more steeply than the others. It starts at a moderate level in 1996, but then declines dramatically, especially after the mid-2000s, and ends at the lowest point on the chart. This tells us that younger adults were affected the most by the overall decline in home ownership. The fourth pattern is that the gap between the youngest and oldest groups is already quite large at the start of the period, and it becomes even wider over time. In 1996, around 74% of people aged 40 to 44 owned a home, compared with about 46% of those aged 25 to 29, a noticeable difference of almost 30 percentage points. By 2015, although both groups decline, the youngest group drops far more sharply, falling to roughly 25%, while the oldest group decreases more gently to about 63%. As a result, the gap expands to almost 40 percentage points by the end of the period. In other words, by the end of the period, younger adults are far less likely to own a home compared to people in their early 40s. So, these are the four main patterns you should keep in mind. All age groups show a downward trend. Older adults always have higher rates. The youngest group has the most significant decline, and the gap between the youngest and oldest becomes wider over time. Once you understand these points, it becomes much easier to write a clear overview and well-organized body paragraphs. Now, let's look at how to write the introduction. This part is very simple. All you need to do is paraphrase the question. You don't give numbers, and you don't describe trends yet. Just restate the idea in one clear sentence. The task says, the line graph compares homeownership rates among four age groups in the UK between 1996 and 2015. A clear and natural paraphrase would be, the line graph illustrates how homeownership levels changed among four age groups of UK adults between 1996 and 2015. That's all you need. Short, accurate, and exactly what the examiner expects. Let's move on to the most important paragraph in Task 1, the overview. This is where you highlight the big picture, the major trends shown in the graph, without including any specific numbers. For this graph, the overview should answer three key questions. What is the general trend? Which groups have the highest and lowest figures? Are there any especially noticeable changes? For this chart, the overview is actually very straightforward. Overall, homeownership fell in every age category over the period, with the steepest declines occurring among younger adults. Throughout the time frame, people in their 40s consistently had the highest likelihood of owning a home. That's all an overview needs to do. State the main trends clearly, without statistics, and show the examiner that you understand the overall story of the graph. Next, we need to plan the two body paragraphs. A useful principle for Task 1 is to group lines that behave in a similar way. In this chart, the older age groups, 35 to 39 and 40 to 44, show similar trends. Both start at high levels and decline gradually across the period. The younger age groups show much more noticeable decreases. The 30 to 34 group begins at a moderately high level, but still experiences a substantial drop by 2015. The youngest group, 25 to 29, also falls sharply, and although it begins at a much lower level than the other groups, it still experiences one of the largest overall decreases, ending the period with the lowest figure of all. So, we'll organize our response like this. Paragraph 1 covers the older age groups, while paragraph 2 looks at the younger ones. This structure keeps your writing logical, clear, and easy for the examiner to follow. Let's talk through the details for the first body paragraph. We'll start with the two older age groups, 35 to 39 and 40 to 44, because they follow very similar patterns and are easier to describe together. In 1996, both groups had high homeownership rates, with the 40 to 44 group at the highest point on the entire chart, and the 35 to 39 group only slightly lower. Throughout the period, these two lines move in a broadly similar way. They remain relatively stable in the early years, and then show a gradual downward trend as time goes on. By 2015, both groups have dropped, but their declines are not especially sharp compared to the younger groups. The 40 to 44 category still ends with the highest figure of all four age groups, while the 35 to 39 group also remains comparatively high. So, when you write this paragraph, your focus is on high starting points, steady, moderate declines, and the fact that these two groups consistently remain the most likely to own homes. Now let's analyze the younger groups for paragraph 2. These two age categories, 30 to 34 and 25 to 29, show much more noticeable declines than the older groups. The 30 to 34 group begins at a reasonably high level, only slightly below the 35 to 39 group. However, unlike the older age groups, its line drops more clearly over time, ending the period at a considerably lower point than where it started. The youngest group, 25 to 29, shows the most dramatic change on the chart. It begins at the lowest level of all four groups and still experiences one of the largest overall decreases. By 2015, this group has the lowest homeownership figure on the graph, falling to around 1/4. So in your second body paragraph, you should highlight lower starting points, much sharper downward movement, and the youngest group ending at the lowest level overall. Before we move on to the model answer, let's quickly look at some common mistakes students make in Task 1. A big one is explaining causes. Don't talk about the housing market, salaries, or the economy. Task 1 does not want explanations. Another common mistake is adding opinions. Avoid saying things like, "This is surprising," or "This is a problem." Keep everything objective. Students also tend to mix data randomly. Make sure you group similar lines or categories together so your writing stays clear. One more issue is forgetting the overview. Without an overview, you simply cannot reach Band 7 for task achievement. Then there's using too many numbers. Only include the most important figures. You don't need to mention every small change. And finally, writing a conclusion. Task 1 doesn't need one. The overview already does that job. All right, let's write the full model answer. The line graph illustrates how homeownership levels changed among 4 age groups of UK adults between 1996 and 2015. Overall, homeownership fell in every age category over the period, with the steepest declines occurring among younger adults. Throughout the time frame, people in their 40s consistently had the highest likelihood of owning a home. In 1996, the two oldest groups, those aged 35 to 39 and 40 to 44, had the greatest proportions of homeowners, at approximately 70% and 74%, respectively. These figures remained relatively stable until the early 2000s, after which both groups experienced gradual declines, reaching around 55% and 63% by 2015. By contrast, ownership among younger adults decreased far more dramatically. Roughly 63% of 30 to 34-year-olds owned a property at the start of the period, but this proportion dropped steadily to about 44% by the end. The most pronounced fall occurred among people aged 25 to 29. Their home ownership rate almost halved, falling from around 46% in 1996 to just 25% in 2015, making them the least likely group to own a home. This answer has 172 words, perfect for task 1, and that brings us to the end of today's lesson. We analyzed the graph, built a full structure, looked at common mistakes, and wrote a complete Band 9 model answer. If you found this helpful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the link below to visit our website, where you'll find the graph and the full model answer laid out clearly. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.